Okay, folks, welcome to everyone in's community call to discuss reimagining Los Angeles County. It is 12:04. We have a few hundred people joining us so far, so now should be a good time to get started. We will be talking with you for the next hour, and I'll be handing it off to our MC, Chrissy Yancey from United Way of Greater LA. And everyone in, you can get us started.
Good afternoon. I'm Chrissy Yancey, Director of Impact Communications and Events with United Way of Greater LA, and the moderator for today's conversation. This is the 5th community conference call from the United Way of Greater Los Angeles Everyone In campaign, which is focused on building political and public will to end homelessness and create more supportive and affordable housing across LA County. Of course, those goals are inherently tied to addressing systemic racism and fixing the damage from racial covenants and other discriminatory practices that have marginalized Black and Brown communities for decades. The Everyone In campaign is proud to be a member of the Reimagine L.A. County Coalition. We see the Reimagine L.A. ballot initiative, now known as Measure J, as homelessness prevention through a racial equity lens. The proposed charter amendment would shift county budget dollars away from incarceration and towards health, housing, and jobs, closing the revolving door between homelessness and jail. Today, we'll dig into both the Reimagine LA County measure as well as get updates on state-level efforts to address housing inequity, and we'll round it out with ways you can take action to help drive these efforts forward. Our goal is for this to flow like a panel discussion. That's a challenge on Zoom, but we'll do our best. We've received dozens of questions in advance of today's call, so we'll try to answer some of those during the conversation. If you're watching on Zoom, you can ask questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to answer them in real time or later on social media. There are 3 parts to today's conversation. First, we'll unpack the community investment and alternative initiatives to incarceration components that make up Reimagine LA. Second, with the legislative session wrapping up in the coming weeks, we'll hear about Sacramento's role in housing and dismantling structural racism, along with an economic perspective on the difference this could make amidst the ongoing recession. And third, we'll hear what advocates are doing and what you can do to make a positive difference. For each group of panelists, I'll start with a question and then we'll move on to a group discussion. Let's get started. The Reimagine LA Charter Amendment is structural change because the reforms will be made permanent in the county charter, and they can only be reversed by a second vote of the people. That's particularly significant because many of us have been demanding for months, really for decades, that we stop investing in the criminalization of poverty and redesign public systems to invest in marginalized communities. Joining us to dive deeper into the Charter Amendment and the initiatives behind it are Felicia Adams-Callan, who is President and CEO of St. Joseph Center, Ionesis Hernandez, Co-Executive Director of La Defensa and Co-Chair of the Reimagine LA Coalition, and Diana Zuniga, a health and justice expert working with the Department of Health Services on the Whole Person Care Initiative. Now, all of you have been working to end systemic racism in our housing and justice systems for a long time. So let's start with a reminder of what hasn't been working and how this Reimagine effort seeks to address those challenges. Ionesis, as a co-chair of the Reimagine LA County Coalition, can you outline how and why this effort came to be and what Measure J would do?
Apologies. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Chrissy, for that introduction. My name is Ionesis Hernandez. I'm the co-chair of La Defensa and the co-chair of the Reimagine campaign. And I want to talk about a little bit of what created the landscape for Measure J to come to life. And so advocates like myself and Diana Zuniga on the call have been working for many years, yearly, to try to influence the LA County budget to invest in the things that we would like to see in our communities, right? Like housing, alternatives to incarceration, and jobs. And every year we were met with, there's not enough resources to invest in these things, right? Every year we're left struggling with how do we fund the things that will help our communities thrive. And so that led us to create a few things that we'll get into later, such as the Care First Jails Lax budget, to the report, and then our Care First budget. But also it builds off of the struggles that a community has been facing for decades, and the work that has been moved by the movement for Black Lives Matter, LA Can, to really help community gain power to push back, right? And so all of these organizations came together to talk with United Way. There was some polling that was done around the work that we were doing and the language that we were pushing, pretty much our demands for housing, jobs, and alternatives to incarceration. And it showed that just how we had been advocating for the things we wanted to see, community felt the same way. The numbers were very in high support for the things that we had demands for, such as jobs and housing. And I'm gonna keep saying those things because although you'll hear it all the time, they're the things that haven't been funded. They're the things that we constantly struggle to get access to in our communities. And so because we saw how unsustainable it was to do budget advocacy every year, how we saw how our communities were fighting against state-sanctioned violence, and how we saw that there was a thirst to do something differently, Measure J was created, right? And so what Measure J would do, it would do some incredible things, which is it would move 10% of locally generated net county cost budget dollars that could go to anything, right? And it would move 10% of those dollars into two buckets. One of the buckets being community reinvestment that looks like youth programs and jobs. And it also looks like hardy jobs that are union jobs that would actually lead to the construction of this decentralized system of care that we imagine would be created that would house alternatives to incarceration. And the second bucket that it would fund is alternatives to incarceration. So community-based pretrial services. For folks that don't know, in LA County, our jail population before COVID-19 was at 17,000 average daily. 44% of that population, which is over 7,000 people, were simply there because they don't have money to get out and pay for their freedom. And so when we talk about community-based pretrial services, those are desperately needed, and that's really why we wanted to include that there. And so 10% would fund those two buckets, community reinvestment, which also includes housing, and then alternatives to incarceration. There's some rules in there, though, that none of the money can go to or go through the legal system or those departments. So from the sheriff's department all the way up to the courts and everyone else in between. But because what we had seen in past years in budget advocacy, and Diana can speak to this as well, was that anytime money came down from, for example, the state, or if there were any dollars at the county that were intended for social services or housing or alternatives, they usually ended up going through the legal system and oftentimes getting stuck there. So instead of creating these roadblocks and pass-throughs, we really wanted to make it as easy as possible for us to be able to fund the things we know are going to help our communities thrive. And so that's what Measure J would do. It would take us to 3 years for us to reach that 10%, and that's a minimum of 10%. That's not the ceiling. So we can even go higher once, we're out of this fiscal uncertainty that has been caused by COVID-19. So we really have just, from up to go here, which is very exciting.
Thanks for that comprehensive response. Diana, can you share from your perspective the work that has happened thus far to create a different system of care and how the funding from Measure J would dovetail into that work?
Definitely. Thank you all so much for having me and for being on the Zoom today. I just want to say, I feel like our advocacy efforts, as Eunice said, have been going strong for over a decade, longer than that, to really be able to reimagine what community safety looks like in Los Angeles County and across the state. In the last few years, we have seen that our local government has actually shifted away from building more jails and actually shifted into developing resources that could really support our community members that we want to prevent from going into incarceration and or support as they're re-entering the community. Across the last 5 years, we've seen the development of the Office of Diversion and Reentry, where they've been able to divert thousands of people with behavioral health issues to community-based resources, as opposed to having them stuck in the jail and or being sent to prison. We've also seen the development of whole person care through the Health Services Agency as well, where whole person care was able to give jobs to formerly incarcerated people and impacted people that could be community health workers and support people that were coming out of incarceration. And then finally, in the last year, many of us were a part of developing the Alternatives to Incarceration vision. This was something that thousands of people pulled together. We developed 114 recommendations that really speak to expanding diversion and alternatives so that care is provided first and jail is a last resort. We did this through a values and consensus-based approach, really focusing on values that looked at racial equity and justice, inclusion of many voices, and human-centered language. And through that, we saw that there's so many programs within the county that can help us build out this decentralized system of care that focuses on prevention, crisis intervention, and also reentry. And those can look like housing and services that people really need before they even enter the system, at the point of behavioral health crisis, at points of violence prevention, and also at points of the system where we want to divert them from the system, whether that be at booking, at pretrial, at pre-plea, or once someone has been sentenced. So there's so many options that we could actually fund instead of incarcerating people. And I think Los Angeles County already has some amazing models to really move that forward. We just need the funding.
Great, thank you. Felicia, St. Joseph Center has decades of experience working with underserved communities. Can you share how the Reimagine initiative could benefit your clients?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. As you said, St. Joseph Center has been serving low-income and homeless individuals for over 40 years. So we have a lot of experience in working with the most vulnerable individuals and families in the Los Angeles area. And with the pandemic and the brutal murder of George Floyd, we really saw cracks emerge in our system as a result of systemic racism. The families that have been served by St. Joseph Center generation after generation tend to be people of color, and they have been left out of the system in so many ways and blocked from getting the resources that they desperately need. Community-based organizations like St. Joseph Center are totally and completely committed to serving the most vulnerable, but we often don't have adequate resources. We don't always have adequate support for what families and communities need most. One thing that we have focused on is jobs and education, because we know while the immediate need that a family responds to or says that they want is housing and food, oftentimes what they really also need is a job and an opportunity, a way to help their families get back on track. And so we offer vocational services and training in the culinary field and also in technology. Those have been life-saving, life-changing opportunities for the families and individuals we serve. We've been at a 70 to 75% success rate of people getting jobs and keeping jobs and able to pay their rent and feed their children and feel so much better. With the eviction cliff approaching and the near 365,000 renter households and 184,000 kids that could be made homeless, we have to do something better and differently here in LA. And we need to reimagine how we can serve communities with partners, with community-based agencies like St. Joseph Center to really make a difference in people's lives. We've also seen that mental health is really needed at the local level. The everyday family struggling to make it, impacted by discrimination in every way, needs help, and often they don't have the financial resources to get the support that they definitely and desperately need. So this is the type of campaign and movement that we need to really address what families need most.
Thank you. And for the follow-up, where are the intersections between incarceration and divestment in Black and Brown communities?
Who's that for?
For you, Felicia.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Where are the intersections between incarceration and divestment in Black and Brown communities?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. We know what families need. They need an investment in the educational systems. They need access to wealth. They need jobs. They need to be in safe communities. They need to be able to be empowered to self-police. Communities that have had an opportunity to assist the elected officials in the way that policies are shaped, they turn out better. There's more investment based on what they feel the priorities are, and we see families soar in that regard. At St. Joseph Center, we look to our families to guide us and tell us what they need. We've also seen in our partnership with the Office of Diversion and Reentry that we can proactively save people who have been incarcerated, who've been lost in that system, and due to their mental health background, they can't advocate properly for themselves. And we step in, we advocate, we use those resources to divert them from a life of being in incarceration. And they are rebuilt in their hope and in their sense of self. And that is that intersection with the overabundance of people of color who are struggling in this community, Black and brown people who are targeted by many systems, including policing. There must be a difference. I know that the Black and brown community needs and deserves an investment that they can weigh in on, that they can feel speaks to their culture and needs, and the kinds of investments that we're talking about today is along the lines of what can change lives permanently.
Perfect, thank you. Ionesis, La Defensa and other coalition members have been doing this work for a long time. Can you share examples of similar programs that have been tried in other cities in the United States or around the world? What models should we be thinking about?
Sure, thank you. So I will say that nowhere else in the country has there been a policy that looks like Measure J. And I say that because Measure J would structurally and permanently change the charter, AKA the constitution of the county. And so that's what I'll say about that. There are other efforts to move funding away from the traditional systems that have harmed our communities, such as law enforcement, that haven't come to fruition yet in most places, but there is a process of that happening. But I want to say that this is special in that way that it'll outlast us. It'll be here for our children, for their children. And so that's what we mean by permanent in the constitution of the county. And so what other models should we be thinking about? So I've been to Portugal, and in Portugal, they decriminalize all drugs, meaning that instead of going to jail or get a charge, you go to treatment, you go to housing. But the thing is that it is not coercive treatment. It is treatment that people have access to whenever they want, and their family members. And so those are the kind of models that we need to be looking at, where we're addressing people's needs first, getting them housing first, and then deal with the other underlying social determinants of health that might be affecting them. And when we say alternatives to incarceration that would be funded with Measure J, that's exactly what we mean. Because like Diana mentioned, if you look at the 114 recommendations, you'll see that a big chunk of them are actually focused on prevention. They're not about, we split them up by intercepts. So, before you have law enforcement contact to when you're reentering the community, but a bulk of these recommendations are prevention, free access to healthcare, mental health, substance use services, all the things we know that are lacking in our communities. But when we think about models, those are the models that we would like. And so we can look to other places across the country, but the work that we've been doing here on the ground is revolutionary and transformative. So we need to be looking within ourselves, because we have set up the landscape we have set up the perfect landscape, but there's no resources to fund it, right? There was an ATI fund created, but there's no money in it. There's ATI recommendations, but there's no way to implement them without resources. So Measure J will actually help us create the models that we envision and that are happening across in other parts of the world. I wouldn't even say in this country, but yeah, we just need to look within ourselves to see those models that we're thinking about.
Perfect. Diana, historically, criminal justice policy reform has come up against fear-mongering strategies, and it sounds like this campaign will be no different. The fear-mongering messaging might argue that the measure will make people less safe. What do you say to that?
Thank you for that really important question. And I think, fear-mongering has been a technique that has been used across our movement for a long time. I mean, fear mongering was used to build 23 prisons and only 3 public universities in the 70s, 80s. It was used when Reimagine was passed to allow counties to build 40 out of 58 counties started building jails during realignment. And it was also used to prevent the passage of Prop 47, Prop 57, Prop 64, very clear criminal justice reform initiatives that helped us reduce populations and helped us decriminalize simple drug possession and petty offenses. Fear-mongering was constantly used in these campaigns. So I think the work that we have been doing for a long time is clearly aware that this is going to be an issue as we move forward with Measure J. What is different this time around is that we have been effective at getting freedom for hundreds of people coming out of the prison system. We now have 5,000 less people in our county jail systems. And we're in a health pandemic, which pushes us to actually be innovative, effective, and quick moving, to really think about how we're going to build an alternative system as opposed to what has been developed that is continuing to keep Black and brown people in unsafe environments. So fear-mongering could continue to be used to impact Measure J, and we are in a completely different environment, and that is going to require us to think differently. We know that folks are coming back home and they need homes to be released to. They need crisis prevention and violence intervention services so that there's no longer this recidivism rate that California has been experiencing for so long. And as Valicia and Eunice says, they need jobs. Jobs are going to be essential in actually generating a workforce that's primarily people with lived experience that are coming back home and need jobs to stay out of incarceration. Fear really can't keep us from transforming. It is about reform, but right now it's also about completely transforming the system. And fear really can't keep us from that, especially in the time where our people are continuing to rise up and demand something differently. So that's what I say when I think about the fear mongering. We know this from our history and we can move forward together.
Finally, for all 3 of you, we have hundreds of people listening right now who are probably feeling a mix of hope and despair. As people who have spent years advocating for change, what advice can you offer? Felicia, can we start with you?
Absolutely. Well, I wouldn't be in this business, and yes, I've been in the nonprofit service delivery business for over 20 years. I do it because of purpose. I do it because my people need me to keep advocating. I can't give up. And so I tell the people listening, we can't give up. I also am really inspired by connection. I know that what we've been able to accomplish up to this point in this country is because we did it together. I believe that this movement is spirited by a togetherness, by a sense of connection, and by an understanding that if my fellow neighbor is hurting, then I am hurting too. The youth who have taken to the streets recently, and many of us have seen that we really can't stand for just watching people suffer while we prosper. So when someone is hurting, we have to stand up. We can't give up. And I believe that we have to connect to one another. And when we connect, that is what keeps us going. That's what keeps us advocating. That's what keeps us speaking up. And that's what keeps us hopeful about going forward and living the best life we possibly can together.
Well said, Felicia. Eunice?
Hi, and apologies, my video is out. My internet is off, turned off. But what I would like to talk about in this point is that, Diana and I did a fellowship, and our project was titled Reimagine Ab109. And our goal was to move 50% of money that was going into probation in the sheriff's department into the things that we're demanding today. And nobody cared about what we had to say. We met with people in the county and others, and it felt like it was just going in through one ear and out the other. And then a few years later, which is last year, we were able to stop LA County's $3.5 billion jail plan after being told repeatedly that what we were advocating for was impossible. And when I mean repeatedly, I mean everybody in the county that we had talked to, right? And then what happened? Last year, the $3.5 billion jail plan was canceled. An alternative to incarceration working group was created. And so, and that was pre-COVID, right? And so what I mean when I say that is that times are really tough right now. A lot of folks are struggling like they never have before, but you know, we have been able to accomplish so much in times where we didn't have this current landscape. And although it's horrific what's happening now, COVID-19, all the things that we're seeing around sanctions violence have created a landscape that has opened the door completely wide open for us to be able to achieve the demands that we've been making for all of our lives. And so I would just suggest that you find people to work with that feed your soul to keep doing the work, because it's not easy. And I know that there's a lot of uncertainty, not only in the work, but even in ourselves and the fiscal, you know, environment that we're in. But, you know, we just got to keep pushing, and we got to keep asking for the whole pie, because if we ask for just a piece of the pie during this moment, we're going to lose so much because the systems will always try to compromise. So don't lose hope. Things are tough, but we're going to keep it pushing. We're going to survive this. And we have to, the status quo won't work for us. We don't want to go back to pre-COVID. We want to thrive. We don't want to just survive. So I would just share that with folks to have faith that we're going to get it through, but try to plug into a space where you can fight and fulfill, you know, whatever it is you need to keep fighting.
Thanks. And Diana, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. You know, I just feel so inspired by Aonisis and Valicia. I even that story that Aonisis said, we have been fighting for so long for these things to happen. And when I started with Whole Person Care, I remember Valicia was one of the first leaders I checked in with about the program. You know, this is about connections. This is about the fact that, yes, we are going to feel despair and a lack of hope sometimes. And we are also winning. We are winning. We are getting our people, Black and brown people, liberation and connection to resources. We are seeing our loved ones, our families in positions of support and providing services for people that are coming back home out of incarceration through the community health worker model. We are seeing services pop up for our people in different ways, because people that have been impacted by these systems are leading the conversation and leading the fight. And I just want to say, we all may feel these waves of despair and lack of hope, but again, we need to hold on to each other, build the community that we've been building, because we are winning. And when Measure J is passed, we will come together to figure out how we distribute those resources equitably to the communities that have been most impacted by policing and incarceration, and all of the other health issues that we know that they're experiencing right now. So thank you. Thank you so much for being in this fight with us.
Well, thank you to all three of you. This is really generous of you to share your time and expertise with us. I really appreciate it. We're going to move into part two. The nation is clearly at a pivotal moment in history, and as always, California is right in the middle of that struggle. For this part of the discussion, we'll explore some of the statewide housing affordability legislation in Sacramento that is either still alive or isn't going to make it as the end of the current legislative session draws to a close. And we'll weave in a view of the pressures that millions of Californians are facing right now and policies that could help them the most. Joining us are Anya Lauder, a leading advocate in Sacramento who has worked with our friends at the Western Center on Law and Poverty for many years, and Dan Fleming, president of the Economic Roundtable, a leading research organization where he has spent a lot of his career understanding the pressures on the most vulnerable people in our communities. Let's start with you. At the highest level, because the Sacramento conversation is not one that we've talked a lot about in our community calls, can you briefly walk through what the approach in Sacramento has been to creating more housing that working and very low income people can afford? Who drives that work? Who are the key advocates working on this in Sacramento?
Sure. So It's interesting because I've been working in Sacramento on affordable housing issues, really focused on, trying to address the housing crisis for those most deeply impacted by the crisis for a long time. And things have shifted pretty radically in Sacramento on these conversations over the last few years as the housing crisis has grown deeper and deeper. And it has resulted in, I think, a lot more people fighting sort of on the side that I work on, but also a lot more groups sort of getting loud writ large on conversations about the housing crisis. And there's been an ongoing tension, I think, over the last few years in Sacramento about, do we solve the housing crisis through supply? We don't have enough housing units, everybody knows it. And so there's sort of a faction that comes at it from a supply side, from sort of a market side. And then I think there are a lot of folks that come at it more from a different perspective. And it's, I think this, this tension between, is it just about housing supply or is it housing justice? And, these sort of market-based supply solutions that are really designed to sort of speed construction of as many units as possible. I think folks that work in the housing justice field kind of ask, when the market itself is a part of and a product of a structurally racist system, how can the market be the solution, right? So for those of us that are working sort of more in the housing justice space, we're really trying to center the voices of the people most impacted, low-income folks, Black and brown people who have been historically excluded from a lot of communities in this state and a lot of neighborhoods, and right, the people for whom housing affordability is truly a catastrophe right now. Right, housing is expensive across the board for a lot of folks, but it's really the people at the lowest end of the income spectrum that are struggling the most. And so, we're coming at it from a perspective of how can we get as many tenant protections in place as we possibly can? How can we ensure that market-based solutions are focused on higher income places, right, that can absorb those sorts of interventions? And how do we protect lower income places and neighborhoods, that have been, experienced historic disinvestment? How do we protect those communities and ensure that we have community-led planning processes in those communities that really look at what does the community want and need to happen here to make sure that we're not displacing the very people that live in those communities as we strive to build more housing supply? How do we get more housing off the speculative market and create more social housing? And that often butts up against resource issues, right? Where is the money going to come from, right, for the housing that the market cannot produce, which is really largely what we need? And how do we push on this notion that there are no resources? Because of course there are resources, right? There are always resources. It's just a question of what are we choosing to spend them on and how can we redirect those resources? And I think those are a lot of the conversations that are, happening in LA and in the country writ large around the choices that we're making with our money. And so, there can be a lot of tension. And I think, some of the key players over the years have been Western Center, who I used to work in-house for, and I now represent as a contract lobbyist, Western Center on Law and Poverty, the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation, Housing Now, which is a broad coalition of housing justice organizations that has just really cropped up in the last few years, is really starting to become an influential player in the direction of things in the Capitol, which is great because they are really lifting up all of the hard work that organizing groups and base building groups are doing on the ground in communities throughout the state, and really making sure that that gets translated into the conversations in the Capitol. So that's been really exciting. There's affordable housing development organizations that work to really ensure that affordable housing developers can function and build affordable housing units, permanent supportive housing units, shelters, things like that. There's tenant rights groups that are having a larger voice in the conversation. So there's fortunately a large and growing contingent of folks really working to address the housing crisis as it's experienced by working folks, poor folks on the ground. And that's great because we're also seeing more organizations also really representing the market rate industry groups and other groups that are really like sort of purely coming from more of a supply side. I'll stop there.
Well, thanks. That's helpful. Okay, now let's zero in a bit. We've heard that there aren't a lot of housing bills left in the Capitol. Many started out, few remain. What bills were you working on? What challenges did you run into, and how are you regrouping?
Well, I will say that, at the start of the year, one of the biggest bills that we were continuing to work on was AB 1279, which was a bill that was intended to allow for approval of affordable housing and mixed income housing in high resource, high opportunity communities, really as a strategy to try to break down those patterns of segregation and increase access for lower income people into communities with high resources. And unfortunately, that bill, we did end up putting that bill on pause, but hopefully we'll bring it back in another year. But as the pandemic hit, the bill that we began working on, which is still very much alive, is AB 1436, which was and still is a bill that is attempting to deal with the looming wave of evictions that we know will come on September 2nd, starting September 2nd, when the Judicial Council lifts Emergency Rule 1, which has put a pause on evictions since May. And that the legislature is adjourning in a little over a week for the year, and there is an urgency to land the plane on that issue, right? We have to make sure that people who stayed home because of public health orders, whose jobs disappeared, who lost income, who are struggling, who have been unable to pay rent, are protected. And that's all I and a whole lot of people have been working on for months, right? And for almost every hour of every day for the last week. And I'm extremely hopeful that we're going to be able to have a solution that can take effect immediately to stop that wave of evictions. I think there's an urgency on that from the governor and from the Assembly and from the Senate, as well as from everyone on the ground who knows what the impact will be if we don't get that fixed. So that's where those things are at. And I will say, there's been a lot of press about how there were a lot of housing bills on the table at the beginning of the year, and there's very few left now. But I will say, the pandemic really changed things, right? There were a lot of bills introduced at the beginning of the year that were really focused on production. How do we streamline production? How do we get more units faster? All of those sort of supply-focused solutions, which, if appropriately calibrated with tenant protections and anti-displacement policies and value capture schemes can be workable. But we're in a recession, and construction is probably going to slow on the natural. And so when the pandemic hit, it seemed appropriate to focus our attention on how do we deal with the immediate housing-related impacts of this pandemic and this current crisis, which is only exacerbating the existing crisis that we know exists on the ground for low-income folks throughout California. And so we are happy that that bill is still alive and that we're moving forward and that we're really focusing on that. And we think that we can come back next year and focus on thoughtful solutions to the housing supply issue, and hopefully put a lot more thought into how do we actually increase housing supply for those who are really shut out of the market right now. So I, for one, am not pessimistic or sad or pointing fingers right now at the legislature. I think the focus needs to be on the eviction crisis, on making sure that small landlords don't go under, on shoring up all of that, because if we lose more of our rental housing market, if we see something like what happened in the wake of the Great Recession, where we lost a ton of properties in California to Wall Street, to investors, to out-of-state folks, that's going to be devastating. If millions of renters throughout California get evicted, that's going to be devastating. And so we have got to be laser focused on a solution there. And I think we can be thoughtful about the rest in coming years.
Thank you for that. Dan, from an economic perspective, what difference could legislation in Sacramento make to communities amidst the ongoing recession, which is likely to get worse? Can you help us better understand the pressures people are feeling?
Thank you. From my perspective, we failed to address problems on the scale they existed last year. And this year, with the pandemic economy, our problems are much bigger. Some 18% of people in Los Angeles County are unemployed. and many more have lost hours of employment and income. The Census Bureau's weekly pulse survey shows that 60% of households in Los Angeles County have lost employment income. Some 18% of us didn't pay or were late in paying rent last month. A fifth of us have no confidence that we can pay rent next month. So we have a looming wave of evictions. And one of the worst outcomes of evictions can be homelessness. The people who are most at risk of losing jobs, who have the least confidence that they can pay rent, are African American residents of our state, young adults, and frontline workers doing basic tasks that we rely on. We have enormous needs in California that can be addressed by using the productive capabilities of these workers to do things that'll make a better life for all of us and make the economy viable. We need to build housing for people. We need to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. We need childcare so that parents can go to work. We need tutoring so that we don't have 36 elementary school students being lectured over Zoom. And we can break out people in individual small groups to have discussions and really learn something. So we have enormous needs that are unaddressed to address housing and to address income for the residents of this state.
Anya, how has the national conversation about systemic racism manifested itself in Sacramento, if at all, particularly in the work to change housing policy?
Well, I think for those of us who really come at it from a housing justice perspective, our work has always been centered on racial justice, right? And I am hopeful that the events that played out this summer and the growing awareness and recognition of the racist that has resulted in tremendously disproportionate impacts in housing access depending on race and income. I'm hopeful that that shifts the conversation over time. I mean, I think it's early to really say how that's going to play out next year. Is there going to be momentum? How much lip service were people giving versus how much are people really willing to dig in and really tackle the structures? I've certainly seen a lot of what I think probably we're all seeing, which is solutions that were already on the table being reframed as coming from a racial justice perspective. And I think we all know that it's not that simple. A lot of people are reading The Color of Law for the first time and suddenly waking up to that history. And I think that's really powerful. But I think what we do about that and how we untangle that complicated web of policies and decisions and that have been made over years that have gotten us where we are, I think it's not so easy as just not doing the bad things we were doing in the past, right? It's much more complicated than that. And I think those nuances are going to take some time to catch up to the policy conversations. But, you know, it's all the same stuff we've been pushing on and that a lot of, you know, advocates have been pushing on for years. And hopefully this growing knowledge will help us over the future really underscore why it is that, you know, for instance, when we talk about market-based interventions, why we are constantly fighting to not have those play out in low-income communities of color, and why we really desperately want community-led planning in those communities. And I think it's going to help connect those dots and hopefully over time bridge some of the tensions that have played out on high-profile pieces of legislation, like SB 50, for example. But we'll see, right? It's been a weird year, to say the least, in Sacramento. You know, I think we'll see what bills land on the table next year and see how much has shifted. And I do think that the legislature is going to come back next year with a sense of urgency on the housing crisis. And I really hope that part of that urgency is to really center the voices of people on the ground who are struggling now and who have been struggling for years. I'm hopeful.
Thanks for that. Dan, I'm curious to hear about the work your team is doing to assess the cost effectiveness of interventions compared to future public costs associated with supporting people experiencing homelessness. What can you share?
Thanks very much for that question. Our perspective is that homelessness is as much a problem of inadequate income as it is a problem of lack of affordable housing. And we're particularly concerned that so many of our comprehensive interventions wait until there has been vast damage that's occurred in people's lives. So we are putting forward interventions that target individuals at the beginning of their path of homelessness rather than at the end of it, and that target intensive interventions on high-risk people who have just become homeless. When we look at the universe of adults who are homeless, most people are making an effort to earn money. And a large share are trying with inadequate success to do that in the formal labor market. That's particularly true of parents, young adults, and newly homeless individuals. So we have joined a partnership that is launching a program with holistic interventions. We're working in partnership with higher education, specifically Long Beach Community College, City College, with the construction trades unions, with behavioral health providers of special services for groups, the researchers at the Economic Roundtable, and with philanthropy, with funding from California Community Foundation and Weingart Foundation. And we're launching a project for homeless young adults that includes housing, behavioral health services, food, transportation, higher education, pre-apprenticeship training, and for people who want to go into the construction trades for linkages to apprenticeship training, and for other support on the career path of their choice. But we see huge needs for income-based interventions in the years ahead. With the pandemic economy, we see long-term levels of unemployment and inadequate income for many, many, many people in our communities, and a need to use their capacities productively. So we are hoping what we're starting can be scaled up, and we see a need to build prototype programs now that provide jobs and income for people and that are of value to the entire community.
That sounds amazing and so impactful. Thank you. And thank you for the work that all of you do. Unfortunately, it's time for us to move on to our final segment. As I mentioned at the beginning, there were some questions in advance of this call, so we'll get into those here. For this final part of today's conversation, I'd like to welcome back Ionisis Hernandez with the Reimagine L.A. Coalition and ask Tommy Newman, the Senior Director of Impact Initiatives with the United Way of Greater Los Angeles, to join us. Tommy, this first question was submitted via email in advance. If Measure J is passed, how do we ensure that 10% is just the floor? I've heard during the Board of Supervisors meeting that more than 10% is invested in these services already. Is this an extra 10%? Was that information accurate?
That's a great and very comprehensive question, and I'll just start by appreciating everybody who made the time to be on this call today as panelists, and thank you to the hundreds of people on the Zoom and the thousands of people across the vast land of Facebook out there for taking time out of your Friday to have this conversation. It's really critical, and we're proud to be a part of it on our campaign here. In terms of the question most specifically, J, as it's now known, Measure J, Reimagine L.A., vote yes on J, we'll start saying that a lot more often, has so many benefits. Not only the money, and the money part is really important, right? We've talked a lot today about moving resources to reflect our values and our priorities. And we know that it'll generate at least $500 million a year. That's according to the county CEO's office, but probably more like $1 billion a year when it's fully phased in, and when we are able to really pull back the curtain, the budget curtain at the county, and have a more clear and transparent conversation around where the monies are going and what money should be available for this initiative. So it's a big deal. I mean, it's larger than Measure H, and for those of you who have been following along for many years, you know, we at United Way worked hard to secure the passage of Measure H, and this is larger than that in terms of quantity. The county budget is a hard one to understand, is a hard one to unpack, and so the measure itself calls out for a transparent, inclusive, and public budgeting process. And so what we'll have an opportunity to do is on an annual basis, instead of fighting to maintain what we have, which is usually what we end up doing on a regular basis, we will be able to build and work and grow year over year with a level of clarity and transparency that we have not had before. An example that I would give is that in the early conversations at the board, there were 3 separate votes. Many of you were along the ride for all of those. In the first vote, supervisors and even some in the CEO's office said, we already spend well in excess of 10%. This is completely unnecessary. Why would we ever need to do this? In subsequent conversations, that number got smaller and smaller and smaller in terms of what was being spent in the context of the eligible uses that Eunesis described in the beginning of the call. So where we landed, and we'll take the CEO's office at his word, is that about $200 million a year is being spent on these priorities, these outlined eligible priorities, which is nowhere near 10%. It's really more like 2%. And then another key component of Measure J is a requirement that there be no supplantation of those existing dollars. So that 200 million becomes the floor, and the 10% builds on top of that 200 million. And so, you know, pretty soon we're talking about real money here. And I think that's the opportunity, is to bring a level of transparency and a level of clarity that we have not had in our county budget advocacy. And the supervisors themselves, I think, when 4 of them voted to place this on the ballot, acknowledged that and said we need to be more clear and more intentional about how we make sure that we fund programs like the Office of Diversion Reentry, like the Housing for Health program, like job training and supports. All things that are important to the county, no doubt, that supervisors have demonstrated are important policies and programs, but absolutely need to be funded at a scale that is appropriate for the largest county in the country.
Thanks, Tommy. Our second question is for Eunesis. The Sheriff's Department is pushing a violent and scary image of LA if Measure J passes. How can I convince people that police don't make LA safer and that alternatives to incarceration can make a more peaceful Los Angeles?
I know she's having challenges as the power turns on and off around the state these days, so I'm happy to take that one if we've lost her.
Looks like she's there.
Maybe.
Well, Tommy, why don't you give it a start and then she'll chime in if she's able to join.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, you know, Diana spoke really well to this early on, but it's a question that we've been getting a lot, and so we're going to be intentional about talking about what community safety means and what creates safe and strong communities, especially communities that historically have not gotten their fair share of county resources. So, you know, I think what's really important here is that this is a measure that I think, I know a strong majority of voters across LA County are ready to support. They're ready to support it because they know that investing in jobs and opportunity and housing stability is how we create safe and healthy communities. And that right there is the key to building a stronger, healthier, safer LA County. This is not about saying we don't need law enforcement. This is not about saying that we are going to get rid entirely of all law enforcement across LA County. This is a campaign and an opportunity, I think, to frame an affirmative vision of where our dollars and where our priorities should be, and to bring more balance to a county budget that has not had that balance. When we see that the vast majority of these locally unrestricted dollars, really precious dollars, are going towards not care first and jails last, but the other way around. When we see the jail population dropping by 30% over the course of the pandemic, but not a corresponding decrease in funding, we know that we need to bring some more balance to our priorities and to our investments. And the supervisors said this many times over as they voted to place it on the ballot.
Yes, and if I could just add, I'm sorry, the technological difficulties and where I'm living.
Is this? I did my best. I did my best.
You did great. You did great. I just want to add, this one piece that those precious dollars that Tommy was talking about, 1 out of every 5 of those dollars are going, for example, to the traditional legal system, such as the sheriff's department in particular. And so what we know is most times when law enforcement is called, when we are experiencing a crisis, whether it's behavioral health crisis, whether it's violence or harm or mental health, folks and law enforcement usually come after, the harm is done, or usually come in the middle of the crisis. And oftentimes people die, people get hurt because there isn't a full understanding of what's happening. And so I just want to remind us of that. And so what we want is really a preventative system and preventative services, right? And that's what ATI is. That's what funding ATI is. It means that people have housing first, so they're not houses in the street. It means that people have good union paying jobs that can help support them and support the desires that they have in their life. And so I wanted to uplift that piece, because we often think that, law enforcement and the legal system is what's going to save us, that it's what's going to make us whole after we experience violence or harm. But most often than not, it doesn't. And it doesn't heal the harm. And the services that we're calling for to be funded are the things that bring families together, are the things that keep people housed, and are the things that keep people from committing harm to themselves or others.
That's great. Thanks, Ionissus. One more for you, Tommy. Why do labor unions not support this measure?
Well, I'm going to reject the premise of the question because that's not true. And I know we are at 1 o'clock, so we'll wrap it up quickly. But we're proud to have Unite Here Local 11 strongly on board with this measure. The Southwestern carpenters who are really critical and have done great work, as Dan mentioned, in helping to invest and create jobs and opportunities for Black and Brown communities. They are fully on board. We appreciate the public defenders being fully on board, and there are more to come. So I will reject the premise that our colleagues and partners in the labor movement are not on board. Of course, change and any adjustment to the status quo always makes folks nervous, and we understand that. And the point that we've been making, and you just heard it again, is that this is about investment in communities where many folks are members of a labor union, are part of a labor movement. And so this is not about taking jobs away. This is not about disinvestment. This is about investment. And that's an argument that we'll keep making all the way through November 3rd.
Terrific. Well, thank you to everyone who joined us today. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate your input, and we appreciate all of you who joined us for this conversation. As a reminder, the Everyone In campaign will be answering more questions on social media. We hope this has been a helpful and informative conversation. And if you RSVP'd through everyoneinla.org, we'll be following up with resources via email and plan to do another call like this one in the future. Until then, thank you all so much, and be well.